So I'm Mark Beneteau, author of the Circling Guide, and I'm here with David Swedlow, my partner. And can I introduce you, David? Just
sure.
Briefly, and we'll pass the baton back to you. But David is a graduate of Circling Europe's SAS, and he's currently on the leadership team for the Austin Circling Studio. And he's a deep thinker, a systemic thinker. I've learned an enormous amount from him. We've been in the men's group for about 1.5 years together, which is one of the things that we want to talk about. And my goal today is to summarize some of the learnings that we've acquired by being together this time, David and I and three other men, and to talk about a sort of circling flavor, circling modality that we're co-creating, that we're calling developmental circling, what that means and how it works. So, do you have anything to add to that, David?
I've also did some training with Gene Houston and with Ken Wilber, and so there's a lot of the developmental piece that has been writing in the background for me for a long time, and the circling piece is new, and as a very deep practice piece is wonderful. But yeah, as you and I have talked about it, there's more room for including the development in circling, and also really looking at. My passion is trying to get this into the workplace, trying to figure out how to make it accessible for.
And maybe that's what brings us together, because my passion is to bring it into the world, and I'm developing programs right now that are bringing AR into sexuality. But more than anything, my burning desire is to take this extremely powerful relational technology into the world in various capacities. And I think many of us who are active in circling, we're passionate about this. We realize the potential here. Because we've seen there's an enormous impact in our personal lives, in our relationships, and the people we've touched, whether they be our colleagues or our lovers or our friends, and just we want to kind of up the game there, shall we say? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Actually, I would like to say, kind of as an introduction for people who may be new to circling, a frame that I have been thinking about lately, that just looking at this newly, recognizing a common experience for people just coming into it is when a group gives a person all of their attention, it's an astounding event just in and of itself. There's an overwhelm of being seen both positively and negatively, right? There's this sense of just, oh my God, I'm here, people are seeing me, what do I do with this? And so the practice really is, in a sense, learning to metabolize attention, really receiving attention and giving attention exquisitely. And that is a lot harder than it sounds. It's a beautiful practice, but the deeper that you go into the practice, the more that you get to show up and the more that you get to have other people show up in your presence. So that's really, I haven't heard it voiced that way, but that is the essence of it, is this exquisite honing of attention.
Yeah, and I want to give sort of my frame or my meaning making or context around that, and just to report also, like, there's a anxiety for me in wanting to be present to you that's happening in conjunction with the desire to make a good, quote unquote, good product that people are going to like. So I just noticing sort of the rising, like this edge of anxiety that is actually not very pleasant to experience. So hopefully that will be shed as we carry on this conversation. So, but I think what you point out, David, as the roles of circling is very, very important and fundamental to the practice of any kind of circling. And let's just cover our basis in terms of circling. Maybe there's people listening to this that are not like versed in the modality, shall we say? But the way I describe it, there's two roles. There's two steps, shall we say? Step one is essentially paying exquisite attention with the goal of, quote unquote, getting their world, meaning to understand how they think and feel, to know what it feels like to be them. And once you have that, As you do that, feelings start to arise in you. You may feel fear, you may feel attraction, you may feel rage, you may feel bored. All kinds of things can arise in you as you go into that process. You may feel love also. So having completed that first part, that's the paying attention. You give them an impact, which is the second stage, which is basically how they affect you, how they make you feel. And ideally, by that point, you're in we space, which means like you're feeling into them in a way that maybe they themselves are not aware of. So you're giving them feedback that, in a way, it's about you necessarily, but it also reflects a part of them. And this is what makes it so powerful. This is why it makes it interesting for them to be a part of this, because they're getting feedback that relates to to one of the blind spots. And it's fundamental to the human condition that we don't see ourselves accurately in relationship to the world and to other people. We tend to narrow in and obsess on certain aspects of our relationship to the world and then magnify them when these aspects are kind of unimportant. And there's other things that are extremely important, but we don't have a clue, right? And this is perhaps what makes circling so powerful from a developmental perspective, because it enlarges or deepens the truth or the reality with which we engage the world. All right. So I just wanted to put that out. That's the overarching frame for all circling, not just developmental circling. Any thoughts on that, David?
Yeah, there's I'll say there's a distinction, and there are, that there are three primary schools of circling, and the more that develops, the more that there is a kind of a distinction and a nuance there. The Circling Europe training, one of the things that we distinguish is, rather than get someone's world, right? Or it's really be with someone in their world, which is the distinction here, and it's really subtle, but it's an important one, is the blind spot that you mentioned is kind of going both ways, right? When I'm reflecting, when I'm with you and telling you what I see, it's not reality. It's my perspective on what's going on. So I can only say what's happening over here. I can't tell you what's happening over there. I have no idea. All I can tell you is how I'm impacted. I may have imaginings, but it's not to say, oh yeah, you may miss it, but here I see this thing that you're missing. Maybe, maybe not. I'm just getting something that you may not be seeing, but that may or may not be a true thing. So there's something really subtle in that. And it's a powerful reminder as I continue to circle that, as I said, it's interesting. I was talking to somebody recently and noticed, if I have a problem with you, that's my problem. And so it's really my way of noticing that, I can feel like I need you to be different so that I can be with you. But it's like, oh, you're actually showing up in a way it's challenging for me to be with myself.
And I'm smiling, David, because this actually just came up in our group yesterday, and it just comes up frequently. It's like, I'm feeling so blah, blah, blah. And it's kind of like, well, that's your problem.
Yeah.
Right. So, so that's an important distinction. And so let me sort of amend what I just said. So it's like you're feeling into the we space and you're making a contribution to that, but that doesn't mean that your contribution is true for the other person. What it does mean is that truth in human relationships can only be discovered through shared reality, through agreement, through just putting it into the space. And even if it's complete bullshit, I like to say, good feedback, will push you in the direction that you want it to go anyway, even if it's bad feedback, right? Someone gives you bad feedback, it's probably going to push you in the direction that you need to go in anyway, even if it's completely off base. So, and the other thing I like to say is that, Quakers have this concept of a gathered meeting. And the idea there is that God speaks more powerfully to a group of people who are in we space, I guess we would say in our day. And I like to say that Quakers actually invented circling in the 1600s. it's not a new concept. It's just the fact that it's become this massive worldwide movement, and I think maybe the technology, if you can call it that, has really been deeply tuned and practiced. And now, as we know, there's like 3 major schools, each of which has a slightly different angle on it. But there's thousands, tens of thousands of hours of practice at this point into the modality. So that's, let's just call it the overarching frame for circling. And I want to sort of tell my story of how I came into the awareness that I have. So basically, I discovered circling in the summer of 2016. In the fall of 2016, I moved to Boulder, and I was sort of intensively circling in there at the Boulder Integral Center, which very sadly is now defunct. But it was an amazing place in the day. When I left Boulder, which was November 2016, I discovered Circle Anywhere. Circle Anywhere was about a year old at that point. And I just fell in love with the practice. And I was on Circle Anywhere every day for about a year. And, Circle Anywhere, as most of you know, is a product of Circle in Europe as well. And, I call it sort of the greatest bang for the buck transformational deal on the planet, in terms of the pricing, $50 a month for unlimited therapy. Are you kidding me? The leadership is excellent. There's a lot of groups to go to. It's not positioned itself as a circling training, but the thing is, you can't circle without becoming a leader. The goal of circling, to my mind, is to become a leader, right? To become a relational leader, which is basically showing up in vulnerability, owning your experience, communicating responsibly, all the things that we know lead to, relational effectiveness. So I did that for a year, and, I will confess in the beginning, I wasn't very good. I really was just totally unaware of my impact on other people. I call it recovering asshole. And really, it took me like 2 or 3 months to even begin to grok the practice, despite, 30 years of therapy and groups of all kinds and other kinds of developmental work. So, circling, it really is a very different frame, a very different paradigm for looking at human relationships and human healing and the process of transformation. And, the more the deeper I go into the practice, the more excited I become about it, and also the more effective I get in my leadership. So just about the time I was beginning Circle Anywhere, I took a big leap of faith, and I formed a private group. And that group went on for about a year, and that group was very successful. After that, the first group folded after about a year, and then I formed the second group, which was the men's group, and invited David and a bunch of friends into it. And that group had, we're now in our past a year and a half. We've been meeting, every week pretty religiously, and every time we go deeper. And all of our lives have been transformed in very unexpected, somewhat miraculous ways. And I won't even go to that story, but I moved to Asheville. I'm starting businesses. I'm building community here. This is sort of I'm kind of living my dream life, really. Pretty much thanks to the circling practice. So this is the first aspect that I want to highlight is the aspect of a group that has continuity. As opposed to a drop-in type of situation, the Circle Anywhere, and you can go very deep even in a group that it's a drop-in group. But for me, the real power is when you're meeting with same people every week, so that pretty much you start already quite dropped in. As opposed to spending the first half an hour or 45 minutes or 58 minutes just getting dropped in, and then getting to the prize, which is the last 2 minutes of the session, which used to happen to me a lot, by the way. So that's sort of the first. That's a bit of my history there, and I'll give it to you, David, which will actually leave me a little time to think where we go next with here. Okay.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
One clarification. You'd mentioned that Circle Anywhere is the best bang for the buck. The unlimited therapy. So I'll mention it's not therapy actually. So it's an interesting distinction. Jordan Allen, who's leading the Austin Circling Studio and part of the Circling Europe team, says often that it can be therapeutic, but it's not therapy, right? And there's something interesting, just to name something, as you said that, the distinction came from me similar to the difference between yoga and physical therapy, right? Physical therapy is actually intended for a specific purpose and moving something. Yoga is general health, but they both have a very physical component, and yoga can be therapeutic. So circling can be therapeutic in that way. It definitely can. And actually the distinction is important, because as we get into developmental circling, I think the distinction becomes even more important, because we are putting more attention precisely on some areas of development. And it's really, as Abraham Maslow looked at positive psychology, this is really positive. There's a positive component here with development. This is distinct from coaching. It really is development by mindfulness in a way that allows something to arise that comes from deep within you. So yeah, I mean, there's some interesting aspects of this that I think that I continue to come to the fore for me whenever I'm looking at this.
That's a good point. I sort of use the term therapy loosely. I should perhaps be more precise in my languaging around that. Yeah. Yeah,
it's just for people's expectation about what that is, right? Right. What they can expect. And there are people who come to this, recommended by their therapists. But so there it is an interesting adjunct to therapy. But if what someone's needing really is therapy, it isn't likely a replacement for it. I mean, this would be something that you'd really want to.
Right. I mean, and my frame around that is like, you have to bring something to the game.
Right.
You have to bring something. You have to provide a certain quality of attention and loving, honest feedback and presence. So if you're really not able to do that, it's not really a good match.
Right.
Right. So maybe my 30 years of developmental work had some impact after all.
Absolutely, I'm sure. I mean, well, it's a little bit about my background as well, and kind of what happened for me. Because I mentioned that I studied with Ken Wilber. And that was almost 20 years ago now, or 15 years ago, I guess. Yeah, about 15 years ago. And so I was very interested in developmental work and integral development. But the practice part of it was really the piece that missed for me. And after a while, the philosophical conversations didn't do it anymore, right? It was like, okay, these are interesting ideas, but if I'm not actually figuring out how to apply them, then I don't know what to do about that. And it wasn't until 2000, it was about 4 years ago, that I discovered circling, and my intuition said, oh yeah, I actually was specifically, before I found circling, looking for something that would allow me to engage in a practice, a body awareness, kind of like, okay, how do I include my body, sense, my emotions in my relating, more than just simply trying to figure them out from a mental frame. And circling was exactly that. It was a very powerful way in which my curiosity and intuition came into play, and it really felt for me, it was amazing. It was like an altered state of consciousness, unlocking aspects of my perception that I didn't know were there. And so there was something like the work that I had done prior to that really kind of readied me, I think, for that moment. But the distinction, and this is a practice versus a philosophy, or as an idea, really was a distinct and powerful awareness for me.
Right, and what my feedback or impact on that is that if you're really into integral theory, you can get into a kind of altered state by reading that. Like it touches something intellectually in you. And from my perspective, circling is doing the thing that integral theory talks about.
Right.
In a very, very deep, experiential way, which is essentially, it's a process of being, right? Of being something, right? As opposed to just understanding it intellectually. So, in this context, Guy Sandstock has a wonderful article, which is, basically if you Google circling, it's the first thing that comes up. It's a distinction between therapy and coaching and circling. And, for me, this is so interesting and impactful. I just wanted to read it or at least summarize it. The primary purpose of therapy is to improve one's psychological health and reduce symptoms or destructive patterns. Therapy assumes that something in the client needs to be fixed or healed. The primary purpose of coaching is to enhance one's performance and take responsibility for one's success. Coaching assumes that the client is already high functioning and is capable of taking consistent action steps, etc. It is results-oriented, generative in nature, and requires the client to be accountable for their lives. The primary purpose of circling is the transformation of your way of being through authentic relating. It is focused on how much access to aliveness and connection you have in the present moment. All right. So how this speaks to me is that by exploring the process of being, problems tend to solve themselves without a lot of effort. Because that's typically our blind spot. We're not aware of how we're being. We're aware of our thoughts. We're aware of our plans. We're aware of how other people are triggering us or maybe even positively or negatively, but we're not aware of how we're showing up. Right. So.
Right. I love that. And the awareness for me is like the coaching relationship is actually a good one to compare and contrast or to hold up in juxtaposition, right? Because there is the where I'm at and where I want to be and how do I focus my attention to get to where I want to be, right? Mm-hmm. The thing with circling is interesting because what often shows up is where I want to be, and the focus is where I actually am, right? That actually is this is where the blind spots come in, right? I often in the coaching relationship, if I think I'm someplace and I want to get here, but I'm not, this isn't the actual place, right? If I'm bullshitting myself about where I'm actually at, any map to where I'm going to get to can be off. The art of actually being where I'm at is a profound part of that, right?
Right. Yeah. That's beautiful, David, and it's sort of I have sort of an equivalent frame around that, which is that to transform, people transform much more rapidly when they first are accepted and accept themselves as they are. It's sort of this great paradox of human relationships or the transformational processes. Like if you're making yourself wrong and hitting yourself for being the way you are, it's quite difficult to change that. Right. That which we resist persists. To quote Werner Erhard as well. So I'm finding this conversation. I'm starting to warm up to this conversation because I'm realizing that circling really, it's inclusive of like really deep wisdom coming from many different fields. And the interesting thing for me is you actually don't have to be schooled in all these different models of transformation to be effective in circling. You just have to show up, and you have to be with people who are going to challenge you when you're not showing up. That's key. All right. And we're going to do so lovingly and not blamefully and not making you wrong, but just sort of reflecting how they feel about you. We had this situation in the private circle here. There was this one of our participants was just like totally in his head. And I listened to him for 5 minutes and was like, Tim, just I don't know what I said, but but somehow it gave him an impact that landed, because his process was precisely that. He wanted to get out of his head. So at first he was a little resistant, and it took some time for him to get that impact. But when he did, it was really powerful for him. And he's been a different person since, from a 20-minute conversation. That's really what can be achieved here. Okay.
Yeah, I would say. I like the analogy, the metaphor of the Gordian knot. The Gordian knot of who you are, like it's in some sense inaccessible in a conundrum, right? And it can feel, it feels like for me most of my life the struggle actually makes the knot worse, right? And there's something about the attention, the exquisite attention in circling that actually releases that, right? The freedom and the invitation to just be who I am without all of the posing and without all of the striving, just who is that, actually softens that. Now, this is the powerful part of the developmental piece, I think, is it not only softens it, there's an exquisite beauty to that experience. And there's also a challenge to that, because I didn't realize, and I think this is true for a lot of people, how much I relied on the contours and geometry of that knot of who I am as a kind of a foundation, a basis. That has been my compass. And in this exquisite attention, as that dissolves and softens and opens up, I am a different person than I thought I was, which is, like I said, profoundly relieving and very disorienting. It can be exquisitely disorienting as well. And learning to actually embody my full self is, it really is an art form, right? It's more than just an experience. It really is an art form.
Yeah, and I moved to hear you speak, David, because it occurs to me that this takes a lot of courage. But the interesting thing is, it's not kind of this white knuckle, I'm going to get this done no matter what, and I'm going to stand in the face of the hail of bullets, and I'm going to survive through this experience. It's actually super fun.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
And I think really that's what I'm so excited about it. I mean, this process is actually fun. I mean, you're getting deep transformation. It's not costing you a fortune, and you're having fun. Right? What's the
right?
I mean, it can be painful, right? As well. Sometimes. And just in the group yesterday, just to go back to that, I was like, it's hard for me to hear the negative impact of how I'm showing up. In this case, was a negative impact of my alcoholism and my repeated failures to fulfill my promises in that context of the group, right? But ultimately, it's good for me, right?
Mm.
So
there was I was talking to Antanas as well, one of the other members of the men's group, talking to him as well yesterday about there's an aspect of who we want to be, like facing that, it's amazing. So what I noticed is the ways in which I try to finagle the situation. This is where the bullshitting comes in, right? The desire to bullshit is like to pretend that I am somewhere, but the real deep desire underneath all of that isn't the success, right? It's not some result or some golden ticket. That's not the actual desire. The deeper desire, when I really feel into it, is to actually be myself, right? So it's a fundamental, it's like that means that any interaction includes the vulnerable possibility of including the possibility of failure or rejection.
Right.
And if I try to eliminate that part, I'm actually moving away from where I want to be.
Right.
And that's from one perspective. It's such a subtle thing. I see myself doing that over and over again in ways in which, it's 4 years of practice, and it's only really in the last year or so that I can more reliably show up in a circle in a way that can be with the ways that I want to hide, as well as the ways in which I'm showing up like authentically. This is different for each person, I'm sure, but for me, it really is like a powerful sense of how do I actually just show up fully right here.
Right. Well, I mean, it sounds like you're learning to have much more self-awareness and more discernment of whether you're showing up as a story or as a concept or as a how do I call it, like a statue or right monolithic type of presence, and you're just getting a lot of discernment of that who you think you are is actually not at all what you are, only a very, very, very tiny piece, right? And I think that's very beautiful, right?
Yeah.
And that, and that's the gift of relatedness, and that's the gift of circling when we do it well as well. And it sounds like you're doing it. It sounds like you're doing a lot of good circling, and I'm really quite inspired by the stories I hear about the Austin Circling Studio. And by the way, if you're in Austin, you really ought to check this out. It's a pretty amazing.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Pretty amazing operation. I mean, essentially, you're repeating what they were doing at Boulder Integral before it folded. So I'm actually very, very happy that this experiment is continuing in a different form. Okay, so let's get to the second stage here, which is let's talk specifically. Basically, we've kind of given first base in terms of what circling is, and maybe even like third base. And let's move specifically to the practice that we're calling developmental circling. And developmental circling has a certain structure, which I do want to describe. But first, how do you see, David, as what the distinction is between traditional circling and developmental circling? And actually, let me answer that for myself. Is that there is more of a focus on development, and there is more of a focus about our work in the world and bringing ourselves more fully into the world, as opposed to having a good time in the circle, for instance. All right. So a developmental circle does not end when the circle ends. The development just actually begins, because it's super cool to be fully ourselves in the circle and to be acknowledged for that. Super cool. Okay. Don't get me wrong. But what's even more cool is to be yourself in the world and be acknowledged for that, and have an impact on people that don't necessarily share this frame, or basically possibly completely clueless about the sort of the joy and the power and the fulfillment that they could have just by showing up as themselves. No masks, fully vulnerable, fully present, just like engaging the world in heart space, essentially, is what it's about. So this is one of the things that I miss in circling, or traditional circling, is sort of like this concept. Okay, guys, we're not here just to have a good experience. We're not here just to connect. Like, we're here really to make something of our lives. And I think that explicit focus on development, I mean, not that that focus is absent in the traditional schools. That focus is always present. But there's a much more explicit focus in developmental circling of, what are we going to, how are we going to live our lives outside of the circle? How are we going to impact? How are we going to love? Right? Do you have anything to add to that in terms of the two?
Yeah, there's a couple of things come up that are beautifully, I had not actually seen from this perspective before. One thing that I would say is the sense that to the extent that circling feels distinct from my life, I'm missing something, right? There is a way that, you're right, coming into the circling practice, it can feel very distinct from, it's like, okay, this is, I'm kind of leaving my life out there, outside, and coming in here and exquisitely giving attention to something else. But like, as you said, if I'm doing that, then I really have a difficult time bringing this self into the world. If those are distinct, they're not really merged. I would say the thing that comes to mind in looking at that is something like an initial naive perception that being is somehow a passive activity. Circling is exquisitely the art of being, I think. And being is not, that sense of presence can often occur as silent wonder, which is just allowing something to happen, which can look passive. And that actually is not the case. It's a very dynamic, in the moment being. And what developmental circling does is actually include my life in this moment, right? Rather than let me set my life aside so that I can have a moment of peace. It's no, I don't want to do this in spite of my life. I want to do this in concert with my life, right? This is an exquisite being in the midst of my whole life, right. Not as a vacation from my life.
Right. I love that. What I'm hearing is your goal would be that the distinction between being in a circle and being in the world would just gradually diminish and ultimately vanish, right?
Right.
No, is that a beautiful dream or what?
Yeah.
I'm enrolled. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think really the benefit of I mean, for me, the purpose of any kind of circle, it's a training ground. You know, it's like, you know, we're here to learn to be fully present through this shared contract we have to be honest and to challenge each other when we notice that we're not present or when we feel the other is not present. And we have implicit permission to take more risks because, and we will typically, not always, but typically take advantage of that opportunity to take more risks because we know we're not going to get slammed or lose our jobs or get arrested for making mistakes, right? Which is that, you know, sad to say, but in the world this is going to happen. Or, you know, or lose our best friend. So that's maybe just another context. Okay, good. So this being said, let's sort of move on to the sort of the structure. So developmental circling has a certain structure that somewhat distinct from traditional circles, and you know, each piece has a function, and there's essentially 4 stages to it. And this is my understanding, and if you have anything to add, I'll hand it to you as well, of course. But essentially, we are more aware of the time, perhaps, and this is perhaps what I do well, is I'm very, very focused on best use of time, and I literally keep a timer, and I'll tell you, okay, you got 2 minutes to check in. After 2 minutes, the timer goes off, and I don't silence it. Well, I tell them, listen, it's a guideline. Do what you want. I'm not going to hold too tight a container, but I want to make sure they hear that timer when it goes off. All right, so that's how I hold the container. So typically lately we've been beginning groups with T group. So I don't know if you're all familiar with T group, but T group, the practice of T group is to simply speak only from the present moment. So in T group, you're not really allowed to share a story, or if you share a story, you can do so under a very, very brief heading. So you can say like headline, and you draw a little square in the air. You know, my wife left me this morning and I'm suicidal. All right. So my wife left me this morning, that's story. So you want to avoid doing that in T group, but very brief context can be interesting. And you're purely in the present moment, what's arising for you in relationship to other people from a feeling perspective. And we have found this extremely valuable in starting a circle because it kind of drops people into present moment very, very fast. And the interesting thing, in my experience, that's, you know, some people love it, some people hate it. People tend to polarize around T group. It's quite interesting, right? But regardless of whether they love it or hate it, it's forcing them into present moment awareness. And there's, you know, once you get it, it tends to be kind of blissful because you're not thinking about anything. You're just being, right? So we like to start with that, and you know, typically we go 5 minutes, 7 minutes, whatever, and then I'll stop and say, okay, good, we're here, we're growth, we're landed. So that's first step. Typically, we don't always do it, but that's typically what we do. Then we do what I call a 2-minute presencing check-in. So 2-minute presencing check-in is what's standing in the way of you being fully present in this moment. You know, and that's when you say, okay, my wife left me, my daughter hates me, blah, blah, blah. All right. And the goal there is not to go into a long story. The goal is just to speak what you need, what you want people to know, so that you can actually show up. Okay. So it's an attempt to clear the, you know, whatever distress you're coming in. It doesn't have to be fully successful, but it's an attempt and it's useful. All right. And, you know, short. That would be stage 2. And stage 3 is what I call, it's an aliveness round. So stage 3 is essentially we negotiate the next stage. We negotiate what's going to happen in the bulk of the meeting, which is just basically a kind of, you know, I basically like to do birthday circles. I like to do short birthday circles. I like to do, you know, sometimes we go more organic. I mean, in our men's group, we tend to go more organic because we've been at it a long time. With beginners, you're going to want to have more structure. around what's going on. Okay, like, Harry, you're going to get a 15-minute birthday circle. And you set the timer, all right? But once the group is strong, you can just basically go more organic. So, but anyway, stage 3 is essentially what's alive. So I would like some time. I have attention on Mary tonight. I want Mary to talk. Something is arising in me that's related to blah, blah, and I'm feeling it. I don't really know that I want to do anything about it, but I wanted to share that. All right, so this is you're essentially negotiating who's going to get the attention for the evening, and if you want a little attention for yourself in the moment, you declare it. This is very important. All right, then we go into the bulk of the meeting, ideally, which is essentially birthday circles or just straight up organic circles. And it's very important as well that you do periodic presence checks. So I will frequently call, I'll do another presencing round. Okay, guys, like, let everyone speak into this space. I want everyone to say something, what's going on for you right now. So just, to interrupt the process long enough to, to get into present moments. And often, we find this happened, this happened yesterday, David, because, Antonis and I were at each other's throats kind of thing. And, people were being affected by that. And, and I called the presencing round. And as we heard, well, as I in particular heard sort of the impact of how I was being, I was like, oh, got it. Let's try something different here. And this is particularly, when things start to get hot, it's it's particularly important to do, to get into a presencing round. Okay, so then, ideally that's the bulk of the meeting. And the final step is actually checkout. And typically this is the most powerful part of the meeting, often. For some reason, I don't know why, but typically it's the most powerful part of the meeting because, again, everybody speaks. I don't time it. I don't time it. I let people go on. Because the idea here is, first of all, you give what you learned, what you experienced in the meeting, and you give your impacts, your takeaways as well. So what I learned about myself is, and this is how I'm feeling about so-and-so, and I understood something profound about them, and I cleared up a lot of my emotional charge around this person, right? And then that's the meeting. And typically this tends to be very powerful. So, and I find it a little sad that for instance, Circle Anywhere, they don't do check-ins or check-outs. For me, the check-ins and the check-outs are just very powerful. To me, they're the best parts of the meeting. Yeah, that's that. So that's the basic structure, and I wanted people to if people wanted to try this out, I think David and I are sort of in the process of writing. We're going to be writing some stuff about that. There's a kind of a major update to the circling guide that's being planned that we're going to say more about this. But that's the basic process. Do you have anything to add to that, David?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that I have some notions. So the structure you just outlined is, recognizably for me, representative of what we do in the men's group. And it has been very powerful for getting into those issues and like recognizing some stuff. It seems, in the way that's similar to, and now that we've started the Austin Circling Studio, there are different nuances of the way that we circle that come forward. There's something of a nuance that I see as coming forward in the developmental circling as well. If anything, as I mentioned early on the nuance that's developing in the world of circling continues. It's an evolution. And so there's something here too that I think is, I'm curious, like hearing you reflect the structure of it has me think there may be some other things in there to look at as well. I think it's a good basis. I just want to note as well, I think that, as you said, there are, it's your favorite parts of the check-in, check-out, and there's a sadness that Circle Anywhere doesn't do that. There's also something that without the surrendered leadership, my favorite form is the surrendered leadership, partly because that's how I was trained earlier on, but I noticed that there is a real beautiful complementary experience with doing both. So, you know, at this point, I would recommend that people have exposure to multiple different circling styles to really include that, not even so much to find the one that's right for you and do that one exclusively, but really the developmental piece includes some letting go, right? There is something that comes up under the focus of here's who I am and here's where I want to get to, the developmental piece of it. There's something else that comes up in the, had no idea that was going to come up, right?
Mm-hmm.
So both I think are very important. So I love the continued exploration of this, and how do we really use this practice as much as possible to get the full range of it. And I would say that the piece that I'm most excited about with developmental circling is that surrendered leadership can leave that part out pretty extensively. I'll say that there are people that I've been circling with for 3-4 years or so who don't know aspects of my life and what I'm passionate about, because it just would never come up in a surrendered leadership circle. And so there can be kind of this interesting thing where it feels like we know each other deeply, and yet the details of each other's lives or the specific nuances of people's life are different, which is very distinct from the men's group, right? That's a place where we do get to know each other very deeply in that process.
Right. We get to know each other when we get to know our stories more.
Right.
And I think I think it's very important, as you say, to try out different flavors of circling, and in particular if you live in a place where you have access to like the really high level circling, like if you live in the Bay Area or if you live in Austin or if you live in Amsterdam or any of those places, like by all means take advantage of the opportunities there. And I think perhaps what you're making me think, David, is like to play with more or less structure. And I'm like super focused on structure. Like I want to come out of this meeting with the sense that, okay, we got something done here. We had an experience, right? And this can be maybe limiting in certain situations. Like it's a step. I mean, it's powerful, yes. Don't get me wrong, but it can also be a step away from being, right? And I think this is where the surrender leadership really falls.
About structure, and
so the willingness to play with more or less structure, and this brings me maybe to the final piece that I wanted to get to cover today, which is that I think of developmental circling as particularly applicable to a business context, much more than surrendered leadership, for example, in that because there's a more explicit goal orientation or developmental orientation. I just think that this would be very attractive to people who have a more of a business development focus rather than a personal development focus. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I do. I mentioned earlier on that I'm very interested in bringing the practice of circling to some extent into business, and actually, what you just said really highlights one of the aspects of that. Circling in the way that it's practiced, surrendered leadership, really would be a stretch to bring into the normal business context. It doesn't look anything like what a business meeting looks like. It's a good background practice that can allow someone to, I found that the more that I practiced surrendered leadership, the more that I was able to bring myself forward into the workplace and be with something where I was challenged or I saw somebody else was challenged, even without the context of developmental circling, right? Mm-hmm. Just individually myself being with something and noticing what wanted to arise and being able to bring attention to that. Mm-hmm. So there's a whole range, I think, of possibility there. But developmental circling, you're right. I think that's very much a good practice for getting stuff done and being with the challenge and impact of who we are in the face of getting stuff done.
Right. Good. I like that because it's not just about getting stuff done, but it's about noticing how we feel about that, right?
Right.
There's sort of a masculine orientation here, but it's sort of softened, by a more feminine or sort of a more being-based way of being. And I think this can be powerful for, for typical businesses that are typically, hyper-masculine in their orientation. Like, we're going to get this stuff done, and, how you feel is irrelevant, right?
Yeah, that's beautiful. So this is one of the things that I think is very powerful. A question that arises in my mind is, why has circling arisen now? And in some sense, we've gotten so masculine, so transactional. We've externalized the relational to such an extent that it's got to find an expression somewhere. And that is part of what I think is the ground of being that it has circling arise as a modality to really be, right? We've forgotten how to be, and it's not an all or nothing thing, right? There is a way of returning that art of being into the workplace, into the space of, yes, include the masculine and include the feminine. It really isn't about eliminating one or the other. It's really the dance between the two, the real synergy. So yeah, that's beautiful. I love that.
Well, and that's beautiful, David. And I think we'll end there. And I'll just add that sort of ironically, we're actually extremely much more effective when we include beingness in in the formula of how we're going to show up in business, right?
Absolutely.
It's becoming evident.